Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm looking at UK politics, in particular the location of sovereignty in the UK political system. Now, from a kind of traditional point of view, then really there's only one answer to the question about where sovereignty lies in the UK system, and that is in Parliament. So this would be a very short video if we just looked at that. So we're going to have a look at a bit of the journey about where sovereignty has shifted and ultimately the arguments about where it is now. So this is part of component 2. It is section 4.4 for A-level politics on the Edexcel spec. And it's called the location of sovereignty in the UK political system, and it asks for students to know the distinction between legal sovereignty and political sovereignty, the extent to which sovereignty has moved between different branches of government, and so we're going to kind of plot some of the movement over time, and where sovereignty can now be said to lie in the UK. Again, as I said, the basic answer to that is in Parliament, but there is a little bit more nuance to it than that, and there is actually an argument in here, and therefore this it makes up something which potentially could be an exam question. Therefore, we're going to have a look at the two sides and some of the evidence and the evaluation of that. So first of all, distinguishing between legal sovereignty and political sovereignty, well, this is really important because this lays the baseline in terms of anything else that we'll look at. So legal sovereignty is where ultimate legal authority in the political system is. Again, that makes sense. In the UK, Parliament has legal sovereignty as there is no higher authority, as it can make law on anything and can't be bound by any law made by a previous Parliament. So in different systems you have different circumstances with this. So for example, in America there is constitutional law, and the Supreme Court can overturn decisions made in Congress or actions made by the President. Well, in the UK, actions by governments can be deemed to be unlawful, but acts of Parliament, they can't be changed. You can't be bound to acts of Parliament that have been made by earlier parliaments. So legally speaking, because an act of Parliament is their highest form of law in the UK, and Parliament can make law on anything it wants, then it has legal sovereignty. So on that one, there isn't really much debate. In terms of political sovereignty, this is arguably something that is higher than legal sovereignty. This is the most important, the highest level of sovereignty in a democratic political system, and it refers to where ultimately political power lies. In the UK, ultimately, political sovereignty lies with the electorate because we are a democracy. And the electorate effectively delegate their sovereignty to their representatives. In the case in the UK, mainly that sovereignty is passed to MPs and therefore into Parliament, which takes us back to what I've been saying all along, that Parliament is sovereign. Well, but the electorate passes sovereignty in different ways to different people. So we have things like devolved bodies like the Scottish Parliament, and you could argue the electorate is passing power to them. We also have councils, and ultimately what happens after an election is that power is transferred into a government in the UK. And actually, they seem to have a lot of the power, and they control Parliament. So maybe political sovereignty, ultimately lies with the government. So Boris Johnson and his cabinet, rather than just with Parliament. And we've seen some interesting debates and fights over that in recent years, particularly over the issue of Brexit, where the government's been trying to get Parliament to do something, and Parliament's been refusing, and that all became very fraught and very difficult until there was another election, and then after that election, the parliamentary arithmetic changed, and therefore the balance changed, and at that point, a government with a majority seems to hold a lot of the political power. When a government doesn't hold a majority, then Parliament seems to hold a lot of the power. So we're looking at this next element, which is the extent to which sovereignty has moved between the different branches of government. So I'm going to look at a couple of kind of key stepping stones in this, and a lot of these I'm going to filter through into the arguments I'll look at the end. So the UK joined the EC, which later became the EU. So we joined in 1972 under Ted Heath, and the EC that we joined then became the EU in 1992, and then we left at the end of 2020. So when we were in the EC and EU, then there was a degree of sharing of sovereignty, and part of this was demonstrated by the fact that EU law was superior to UK law, and this was illustrated by the Factor Tame case, which, ironically, given a lot of the stuff that's in the news at the moment, was about fishing rights, and saw UK law overturned as it conflicted with EU law. Over time, the UK negotiated various opt-outs over the years to try to secure parliamentary sovereignty in certain areas and prevent the EU ideas or laws kind of restricting what the UK did in certain things, and that was kind of a form of Euroscepticism and a way, again, the argument was often presented about sovereignty at this point. The Brexit, it was at least in part about regaining parliamentary sovereignty. The UK left the EU at the end of 2020, and in this you can say that actually it was the case that there was some sovereignty which wasn't sitting with Parliament, it was sitting with the EU, but since 2020 that sovereignty has been regained, it has been taken back, and it now lies with Parliament again. Another way in which you can argue that sovereignty has moved over time is with the devolution project, which was started by the Labour government back in 1997. So devolution has led to the creation and then the extension of the powers of bodies such as the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Parliament. And Parliament, the Westminster Parliament, has transferred some of its powers, including the ability to make laws in certain areas, to these devolved bodies. However, it can be argued that yes, they've transferred powers, but actual full-blown sovereignty has not been transferred, as these bodies were created by Acts of Parliament and can be dissolved by Acts of Parliament. The UK is not a federal system. It's not a system like the US where sovereignty is spread out amongst the different branches of government and then in between state and federal government. Ultimately, power in the UK, political power, political sovereignty, lies with Parliament because it's chosen to give away some of its power, but it could easily take it back again. Now, whether that's definitely the theory, whether that's the reality is an issue for debate. And the fact that sovereignty hasn't been completely given away explains things like the demand for India F2 and independence in Scotland, because the Scottish Parliament saying we want sovereignty, we want Scottish sovereignty, we don't want to be beholden to England and the Westminster Parliament, and we don't have that complete freedom under devolution because the sovereignty still lies with Westminster, and they want to end that. Now, again, that's a different argument, but it plays into this one in terms of whether sovereignty has moved. Now, you can argue lots of powers have been transferred to the devolved bodies, and therefore maybe that's a sign of sovereignty having moved. And particularly if you don't believe that actually realistically Parliament could take those powers back. On the other hand, if you look at it and go, actually all it takes is an act of Parliament, the Scottish Parliament doesn't exist anymore, then that would suggest there isn't a transfer of sovereignty, and the fact that you've got campaigns for independence again would suggest there hasn't been a transfer of sovereignty. Linked to the idea of devolution, because devolution was brought back following these, but also these have been used on a range of other matters, particularly anything to do with constitutional change, so the idea of a new voting system, the idea about leaving the EU, have been put to the people, the electorate, through referendums. Now, this again suggests a movement of sovereignty from Parliament and back to the people, where the people, rather than entrusting the representatives to make the decisions for them, are making the decisions themselves. So this would be a movement in sovereignty again. There is a counter to that, where you go, well, actually the referendums are technically advisory, they're not binding, and therefore Parliament could choose to ignore them. In fact, constitutional lawyers made this very argument on the Brexit result. However, again, a bit like we can talk in theory about the removing of the Scottish Parliament by Westminster, but the public outcry on that would be terrible. I mean, again, when we saw a lot of anger and stuff around the idea when it looked like Parliament wasn't going ahead or wasn't making sufficiently quick progress over the whole Brexit issue, that by not following through on that, then there's a huge public backlash, and prime ministers and MPs need to get re-elected, and so it would be very foolish of them to have a referendum and then ignore its results because they're elected by the people to do what the people want, and if they aren't going to do what the people want, as in terms of what they said in the referendum, then they'll choose somebody who will. And fundamentally, that can be said to have had a big impact on the elections following that 2016 referendum. Another area where it looks like a degree of sovereignty is shifted is in the area of rights in the judiciary. So we got the Human Rights Act, which dates back to 1998, and we have the Supreme Court, which came into effect from 2009. So the Human Rights Act increased the power of judges to rule on whether acts of Parliament, laws made, either complied or conflicted with the Human Rights Act, and so they can make a point of law and say that law you've just made actually contradicts or conflicts with or breaks the Human Rights Act. Now, they can't actually overturn it, but they can point out to Parliament that they should look at it again. The Supreme Court's was created, and again, the name seems to ring a bell with the American equivalent, and you're thinking, well, actually, we've got an independent judiciary that can actually check on other branches of government, and we can see the Supreme Court acting as a check on the government in terms of the deeming the proroguing of Parliament to be unlawful. But the Supreme Court cannot overturn an act of Parliament. The Parliament could create acts of Parliament that overturned the Human Rights Act. Who would do that, you would ask? Well, actually, that was in the most recent Conservative manifestos. They could, and they talk about replying to the Bill of British Rights. I mean, it's not saying that they're going to remove all rights. It's just that particular act and the impact that's had on British politics actually and law could be removed. And they also could theoretically abolish the Supreme Court. I mean, it was created by an Act of Parliament back in 2005. It could be removed by an Act of Parliament. And this is the thing about the supremacy of parliamentary law in the UK, and there is no higher level of law. And this again suggests Parliament is sovereign. Right. So where can sovereignty now be said to lie in the UK? Well, the first answer to that is it lies with Parliament, and Parliament has the power to pass any law it wants on any subject, and there is no political body above it. It's not bound by laws that have been made by previous parliaments. So really, you could argue that the Parliament is truly sovereign. There's not really any restraints on what it can do. So Parliament could abolish the devolved bodies. So the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Parliament, the various kind of bits of law that have been brought in, creating the city region mayors, all that kind of stuff. They could get rid of all of it. It's not bound by any earlier agreements that it's been made that yes, in the future, if we were to remove the Scottish Parliament, there'd have to be another referendum, all that kind of stuff. Well, yeah, that's an Act of Parliament. Any Act of Parliament can be overturned by a new Act of Parliament. So the UK is not a federal state. Actual sovereignty hasn't been transferred. Sovereignty remains with Parliament. We've seen, again, I've just mentioned in a bit earlier on, that the courts can rule that a law conflicts with the Human Rights Act, but cannot force Parliament to change it. Brexit means that EU law no longer takes precedent over UK law. So the only time when we have had anything above parliamentary law was in the period of time when we were in the EU, and some EU laws were seen to take EU law was seen to take precedent over UK law. And so you could say now, conclusively, with that change, Parliament is sovereign in the UK. Now, the counter arguments to this is essentially that's all just theory, and actually an awful lot of stuff I've been speaking about, it could never really happen in practice. So again, with that gap between reality and theory, you could say, well, technically, Parliament can ignore referendums, which are only advisory. Theoretically, it could disband the Scottish Parliament. Now, both of those actions would cause absolute outrage, and in reality, because of the nature of democracy, they're just not going to happen, because that would be a political party, political leaders kind of signing their own kind of political death warrant. They were kind of going, right, yeah, we don't ever want to be in power ever again. Please vote for other people. Another argument against the sovereignty lying solely with Parliament is the idea that actually Parliament itself isn't at the top of the food chain in all of this. Parliament is actually dominated by the executive. So with the power of patronage and party discipline, a prime minister and their cabinet can dominate Parliament and everything that happens in Parliament. And I've done previous videos on Parliament, which I should go back and look at with some of the detail on this. Well, actually, yes, there's a little bit of time for the opposition, and yes, there's a little bit of time for backbenchers, and the Backbenchers Business Committee have kind of beefed this up a bit. But essentially, almost everything that happens in Parliament is dictated by the Prime Minister and Cabinet. And so actually the sovereignty really sits with the government and not with Parliament, particularly if a government has a sizable majority, which our current government does. And people have written about this in the past, and they've explained this as an elected dictatorship, that following a general election, a party gaining a majority, essentially until the next election, can do what they want. And because of the power of party unity and party discipline in the UK, then yeah, you might get the odd rebellion, but essentially the government will do what it wants. Another more broad argument, or two other kind of broader more arguments, are first of all that ultimately sovereignty sits with the people, not with Parliament, and you could beef that up with evidence that we talked about earlier in terms of referendums and things like that. And the other one is kind of a very, I think, significant point in the modern world, which talks about globalization, and therefore the degree of sovereignty anywhere in the world has been hugely diminished. So the UK cannot just act unilaterally on things; that it's bound by international agreements. So it might have left the EU, but it's still in the UN and NATO, and it still signs things like the Paris Accords and climate change agreements and things like that. So therefore, with globalization, governments and parliaments can't really completely control their economies because they're affected by global events. A good example of that would be the 2008 crash, which, I mean, there's various debates about what the government could or couldn't have done, but essentially that crash would have happened anyway, and it wasn't created by the government, and the governments therefore had to react in it. So Parliament and government in the UK cannot act in isolation. It is impacted on by international markets, international business, international agreements, supranational organisations. So therefore, really saying sovereignty lies inside an individual parliament would be, in the modern world, naive, is the argument on that one. So hopefully that gives you a really good idea of the arguments about sovereignty in the UK and where it is located, and a bit of a backdrop of some of the history about how it has moved over the last 40 or 50 years in different ways. Again, as I said, hopefully this has been helpful. If it has been, then please hit like. If you have any questions or comments, then please leave those below. And if you haven't already, then please do subscribe. I've now got well over 150 videos covering A-level politics in this playlist, and so everything you need for component 1, component 2. In particular, if you do nationalism as your non-core ideology, and also the whole of component 3A, which is the USA unit. So again, there is hopefully everything you could possibly need in terms of content, and there's also a series of technique videos on how to do the different question types and how to get top grades and all that kind of stuff. There's also a whole range of A-level history playlists on here covering bits of American and Russian and UK history. So hopefully plenty on there, hopefully to keep you entertained, and also to help you with your studies, or just to expand your mind a bit about bits of history and politics. Thank you very much for watching.